The Dark Secrets of Cork District Lunatic Asylum, Ireland's most haunted asylum. The Cork District Lunatic Asylum, now part of St. Finbarr's Hospital in Cork City, has stood for nearly 2 centuries as one of Ireland's most haunting reminders of the country's troubled history of mental health care. Hidden behind aging stone walls and towering trees, the institution has witnessed thousands of lives marked by suffering, hope, despair, and death. While modern medicine has transformed much of the site, stories of unexplained voices, shadowy figures, and ghostly encounters continue to surround the oldest sections of the hospital. To this day, many locals believe that not every patient who entered the asylum ever truly left. The story began in 1848, during one of the darkest chapters in Irish history, the Great Famine. Designed by renowned architect Sir William Dean Butler, the Cork District Lunatic Asylum was built to accommodate several hundred patients suffering from mental illness. At the time, understanding of psychiatric conditions was extremely limited, and those experiencing depression, dementia, epilepsy, trauma, or learning disabilities were often institutionalized for years or even for life. Families struggling with poverty sometimes had no choice but to send loved ones to the asylum, hoping they would receive care, though many would never return home. The opening of the asylum coincided with widespread starvation, disease, and economic collapse throughout Ireland. The emotional trauma caused by the famine resulted in a dramatic increase in patients suffering from psychological distress. Admissions quickly exceeded the building's intended capacity. Within only a few decades, overcrowding became one of the institution's greatest challenges. Long rows of iron beds filled the wards, and patients lived in cramped conditions with little privacy. Historical records show that the staff often struggled to cope with the growing number of admissions. Life inside the asylum followed a rigid routine. Patients rose before dawn, ate simple meals, and spent much of the day performing manual labor around the hospital grounds. Gardening, laundry, farming, and maintenance work were considered forms of therapy during the Victorian era. While some patients genuinely benefited from structured routines, many others endured years of confinement without meaningful treatment. Modern psychiatric medicine did not yet exist, leaving doctors with very limited options to help those suffering from severe mental illness. The asylum's stone corridors echoed with the sounds of daily life. Some patients cried throughout the night, calling for family members who would never visit. Others wandered endlessly through the wards, unable to remember who they were or why they had been admitted. Nurses recorded cases of patients who spent decades inside the institution, watching the outside world change while remaining trapped behind locked doors. Many eventually died without ever leaving the hospital. Death was a constant presence within the asylum. Infectious diseases such as tuberculosis, pneumonia, influenza, and other illnesses spread rapidly in overcrowded conditions. During the influenza pandemic of 1918, psychiatric hospitals across Ireland experienced devastating losses, and Cork was no exception. Numerous patients were buried in modest graves, some identified only by numbers rather than names. For many families, the stigma surrounding mental illness meant that these individuals faded quietly into history, their resting places forgotten by later generations. As psychiatry evolved during the 20th century, the treatments available inside the hospital changed as well. Electroconvulsive therapy, insulin shock therapy, and powerful sedative medications became part of psychiatric practice during different periods. While many of these treatments were introduced with the intention of helping patients according to the medical knowledge of the time, some former patients later described them as frightening and deeply traumatic experiences. These difficult chapters have contributed to the asylum's unsettling reputation. It is after sunset that the stories become far more mysterious. Former nurses have spoken quietly about hearing footsteps following them through empty corridors during overnight shifts. The strange sounds would always remain several paces behind, matching every step they took. Whenever they stopped walking, the footsteps stopped as well. Turning around revealed nothing except the long, dimly lit hallway stretching into darkness. Maintenance workers have reported equally unsettling experiences. Heavy wooden doors that had been securely closed somehow opened on their own. Rooms that had been locked minutes earlier were later found standing wide open. Workers often blamed old hinges or shifting foundations, yet some admitted that certain sections of the building gave them an overwhelming feeling of being watched. Several refused to work alone in the oldest wings after dark. Another frequently reported phenomenon involves whispered voices. Staff working late at night have described hearing distant conversations echoing through unused corridors. Sometimes the voices sound like patients asking for help. At other times they resemble quiet arguments between people who cannot quite be understood. Whenever employees investigated the source of the sounds, they found completely empty rooms and silent hallways. Among the most famous legends associated with the old asylum is the mysterious woman dressed in an antique hospital gown. According to multiple stories shared by former staff members, the pale figure has occasionally been seen standing silently at the far end of corridors in parts of the Victorian building. Witnesses describe her as motionless, with her head lowered and her long clothing hanging almost unnaturally still. As they cautiously approach, she slowly fades from sight before disappearing entirely without making a single sound. One former maintenance engineer recalled an experience that changed his opinion forever. While inspecting electrical equipment in an old basement beneath one of the original wards, he suddenly heard someone breathing directly behind him. Assuming another worker had entered the room, he turned around expecting to see a colleague. Instead, the room remained completely empty. Moments later, he felt what seemed like a cold hand brush lightly across the back of his neck. Terrified, he abandoned his tools and hurried out of the basement. According to co-workers, he never willingly entered that area alone again. Hospital cleaners have also contributed to the growing collection of ghost stories. Several have reported hearing the unmistakable sound of heavy metal beds scraping across the floor late at night. Expecting patients or maintenance staff to be moving furniture, they followed the noise into the nearby wards. Every bed remained perfectly in place, and no one else was present. The sound simply stopped as soon as they entered the room. Security guards working overnight shifts have occasionally encountered unexplained activity on surveillance cameras. Motion detectors activate in vacant hallways where no one is supposed to be. CCTV footage sometimes appears to show dark human-shaped figures walking briefly across corridors before disappearing around corners. Yet when guards immediately investigate the locations, they find no sign of intruders and no evidence that anyone had entered the building. Paranormal investigators who have visited areas connected to the original Victorian asylum claim to have recorded unusual events. Electronic voice recorders have allegedly captured faint whispers that were not heard during recording. Cameras sometimes malfunction without explanation, while fully charged batteries drain unusually quickly in certain rooms. Temperature monitoring equipment has occasionally detected sudden cold spots despite stable weather conditions. Although none of these findings provide scientific proof of paranormal activity, they continue to fuel the asylum's haunted reputation. One enduring piece of local folklore tells of an elderly patient who spent over 40 years inside the asylum after being abandoned by his remaining family. According to the legend, he became so accustomed to life within the institution that he rarely spoke to anyone during his final years. After his death, several nurses supposedly reported seeing an elderly man quietly sitting beside the same window where he had spent countless afternoons staring into the gardens. Whenever someone approached to speak with him, the chair was found completely empty. Skeptics argue that every reported haunting has a logical explanation. Old stone buildings naturally produce strange sounds as temperatures change. Long corridors can distort echoes, while exhaustion during overnight shifts may cause the mind to misinterpret ordinary events. Given the emotional weight of the hospital's history, it is easy to understand why stories of ghosts continue to spread from one generation of workers to the next. Yet many former employees remain hesitant to dismiss the experiences entirely. Some openly admit there were areas they never liked entering alone after midnight. Others refuse to discuss certain incidents at all. Whether out of respect for former patients or because of something they personally witnessed, many simply change the subject whenever the old asylum is mentioned. Today, St. Finbarr's Hospital continues to serve the people of Cork with modern healthcare, while much of the original Cork District Lunatic Asylum has been renovated or replaced. Nevertheless, its Victorian buildings remain powerful reminders of nearly 200 years of psychiatric history. Thousands of lives passed through those stone walls, each carrying stories of heartbreak, hope, recovery, or tragedy that history has largely forgotten. Perhaps that is why the old corridors continue to inspire fear. Whether the unexplained voices, shadowy figures, and phantom footsteps are the result of restless spirits or simply the echoes of a painful past remains impossible to prove. But on quiet nights, when the wind moves through the ancient buildings and the halls fall silent, many in Cork still believe that the asylum remembers everyone who ever entered its gates, and that some of those forgotten souls are still waiting to be heard.